Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. If you've ever walked away from a trade show wondering whether the investment actually translated into pipeline, this conversation is for you. In MedTech especially, trade shows are still one of the largest single line items in commercial budgets. Yet many leadership teams still struggle to clearly connect those events to measurable revenue outcomes. Today, we're going to challenge the way that events are typically executed and show you how to turn them into something far more powerful, not just activity generators, but structured deal acceleration environments. We designed this session specifically for leaders who have to defend their commercial spend. Because if you've ever sat in a board meeting where someone asks, well, what did we actually get from that trade show? You and I both know how uncomfortable that conversation can very quickly become. Trade shows, yes, they are expensive, but they can also be one of the best deal accelerators if they're structured correctly. So, for those of you who may not know us, I'm Lauren Dustman. I'm CEO of BMMG, and our work focuses on helping medtech companies turn clinical innovation into commercial traction. That includes market strategy, messaging, commercialization planning, and how companies operationalize their events and field presence. And I'm joined today by Kimberly Stansell.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm Kimberly Stansell, Senior Event Manager, aka the Trade Show Maven at BMMG. My role focuses on the operational side of execution. Events succeed or fail in the details, such as speaker coordination, account targeting, logistics planning, meeting structures, and follow through systems. Those are the disciplines that transform an event from a chaotic booth experience into a strategic commercial program.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here today, Kimberly.
Thank you.
And who is BMMG? Well, I briefly touched on it, but BMMG is a global medtech commercialization authority helping innovative companies move from funding to liquidity with confidence. More than just a traditional marketing firm, BMMG provides commercialization intelligence, ecosystem fluency, and integrated strategy across regulatory, reimbursement, investor communications, and go-to-market execution. With a track record supporting 19 acquisitions and 8 IPOs, BMMG partners with medtech leaders to engineer adoption, mitigate commercialization risk, and build scalable growth platforms. Now, before we get into our trade show strategy and framework, I want to acknowledge the reality that many of you might be operating in. Trade shows are not small marketing activities. They are major commercial investments. And between booth builds, travel, sponsorships, and leadership time, a single event can represent a significant spend for your company. And ultimately, you are accountable for revenue, not just badge scans. And collecting hundreds of leads might look good in a report, but it doesn't mean the event actually moved your business forward. Your sales team is also stepping away from their territories to attend these conferences. They can't afford to spend 3 days on what we sometimes call hope marketing, showing up, scanning badges, and hoping that something turns into pipeline later. And many of you eventually have to justify event investment to leadership, a board, or investors. So the real question becomes, did your event create pipeline or just generate activity? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Could you defend your last trade show investment in a board meeting based on pipeline impact? Not booth traffic, not leads, but actual pipeline impact. Because that distinction is going to tell you a lot about how your event was structured. Interesting. So, okay. So we're seeing more no's than yeses, and that's okay. That's why we're here today to talk about the overall event strategy and structure. All right, we're going to go ahead and end that poll. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so this slide is going to pop up several times throughout today's program. Think of this as our webinar roadmap. It shows us what we've covered, where we're at, and where we're going next. So let's talk about the current trade show reality. Kimberly?
Let's start with what's happening at the industry level. According to the Sierra Index, Total Index, the exhibition industry is still recovering from the pandemic. Overall exhibition activity is 11.1% below the 2019 baseline. Professional attendance is down 12.3%, and the number of exhibitors is down about 5%. Now, why does this matter? Because the environment inside the exhibit hall has fundamentally changed. There are fewer attendees, but companies are still investing heavily in exhibiting. So competition for attention has increased significantly. That means the companies who succeed are not the ones with the biggest boosts. They're the ones who arrive with a structured account strategy already in motion.
Absolutely. And when we look at the company level data, the financial commitment becomes even more clear. For most organizations, a typical trade show presence costs between $12,000 and $30,000 for even just a modest footprint. The median company also attends about 6 exhibits per year, and the average cost per trade show lead is roughly $112. And I know some of you might be thinking, whoa, mine is way more than that, or it's less. That is going to vary obviously from industry to industry. And if you are going and you're selling a single disposable device versus capital equipment, but we can talk about what your average trade show lead should be, just based on your environment and your product. Um, and here's the challenge that we see repeatedly is that while many organizations are tracking their cost per lead, they don't track the pipeline progression after the event. So leadership ends up looking at a spreadsheet full of leads without knowing how many of those actually became opportunities. Kimberly?
This is where execution discipline becomes critical. Research shows that 75% of attendees plan which booths they will visit before they arrive to the show, which means if companies wait until the exhibit hall opens to engage with prospects, they're already behind. Second, attendees only spend about 8 to 9 total hours in the exhibit hall across the entire event. And that's not much time. So every conversation matters. And yet, only 28% of exhibitors say their lead capture process is highly effective. Then comes the biggest failure point. Studies from the Harvard Business Review show that roughly 80% of trade show leads never receive meaningful follow up. So when companies say trade shows don't work, what we often find is that the execution system around the event is broken.
Absolutely. So now let's talk about what leaders should expect from events. One of the biggest shifts that we encourage leadership teams to make is redefining how your events are evaluated. Historically, success was measured through activity metrics. So that's booth traffic, badge scans, lead counts. But those metrics don't tell you whether an event actually moved the pipeline forward. What leaders should really expect from events is just that. It's pipeline movement. Did priority accounts advance? Did new opportunities begin? Did our existing deals accelerate? And a trade show, as a leader, you should expect this. A trade show should not function as a lead collection machine. It should function as a deal acceleration environment. The best performing companies walk into an event already knowing which accounts they need to move forward. The event simply just creates the opportunity for deeper and faster conversations. Kimberly?
When events perform well, there are usually 5 disciplines in place. First, there is a targeted account strategy before the show. Second, teams secure pre-booked meetings with decision makers. Third, conversations on site have clear qualification criteria. Fourth, the team captures specific next steps before the meeting ends. And fifth, follow-up ownership is assigned within 24 to 48 hours. When these 5 disciplines exist, trade shows start to behave very differently.
Absolutely. And maybe you guys are thinking, oh, well, that's all good and well, but that sounds complicated and like a lot of work. So, how do we actually do that? Well, now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of today's discussion, which is that pre-show strategy. So, 10 to 12 weeks before the show is where the most important strategic decision about your event should happen. And interestingly, it has absolutely nothing to do with the booth design or the logistics. It's deciding what success actually means for your commercial organization. One pattern that we've seen across MedTech companies is that teams often go into a conference with fairly vague objectives like generate X number of leads or increase awareness, maybe boost web traffic. But those objectives don't actually create focus or change behavior of your team when they're on the ground. So, what we encourage teams to do instead is start with a revenue objective that's tied to the event. That can mean defining things like a pipeline creation target tied to the conference, a stage progression target for existing deals, or a net new accounts objective. When the sales team knows that the event is expected to move a specific dollar amount of pipeline, the strategy becomes so much clearer. And from there, the next step is defining success metrics that support that revenue goal. For example, how many pre-booked meetings do we need to secure before the show? How many target accounts need to engage with us on site? And how many post-show meetings should already be scheduled before the event ends? The strongest programs we see often have half of their booth conversations scheduled before the show floor even opens. The next step is building a target account list. Typically, this is about 15 to 20 priority accounts that the commercial team wants to advance while everyone is in the same city. Those accounts usually fall into three categories: open opportunities already in the pipeline, priority growth accounts aligned to the company's commercial strategy, or at risk deals that need that face to face momentum. Trade shows are one of the rare and beautiful moments where clinicians, administrators, and industry partners are all in the same place at the same time. That makes them incredibly powerful for accelerating real opportunities. So once that account list is defined, the next step is assigning ownership. Every priority account should have a clear primary owner responsible for engagement, and sometimes a secondary support role, such as clinical leadership, marketing, or executive support. Without clear ownership, you often see multiple people assuming that somebody else is handling the relationship on site and post show. And finally, this is where companies should determine whether ICW engagement, that's in conjunction with engagement, can be leveraged strategically. This is typically where executive involvement can make a real difference. A team should identify 5 to 10 priority accounts where executive participation could accelerate a decision, help unblock a stalled opportunity, or deepen relationships with key institutional stakeholders. For each of those accounts, the team should define what deal progression they want to achieve and which executive sponsor will be aligned to that conversation. Because when all of these pieces are defined 10 to 12 weeks before the show, your outreach can then begin early. And that really does matter because, as Kimberly shared, research shows that about 75% of attendees plan all of their booth visits in advance of a program. So if the right accounts haven't already been contacted by the time that you're on site or a couple weeks before the show, the event often becomes reactive instead of strategic. And that's the difference between simply showing up at a conference and actually using it to move real business forward. Kimberly?
8 to 10 weeks before the show is where the strategy we just discussed becomes operational. This is where teams should begin targeted outreach to priority accounts. And when we say outreach, we don't mean a generic email blast saying, we'll be at booth 423. What works much better is account-based outreach, starting with identifying which specific people within your target accounts are likely to attend the conference. If the conference provides an attendee list, that's the easiest starting point. But even if it doesn't, there are still several ways teams can identify attendees. Your sales team should be reviewing prior year attendee lists, cross-referencing contacts in CRM, looking at LinkedIn activity, or using platforms like Apollo or Alpha Sophia to identify decision makers. And during the outreach, reps should also be confirming attendance directly by saying, will you be at the first meeting this year? Once you know who is likely attending, the next step is tying that outreach to that organization's priorities. Before contacting anyone, reps should spend a few minutes researching the account, reviewing hospital and health system websites, looking for expansion plans, new service lines, or strategic initiatives, checking recent news like acquisition, funding announcements, or awards. This type of outreach then becomes contextual. Instead of saying, will you be at booth 423, the message becomes something like, we saw your health system is expanding your GI service line this year. A lot of the organizations we're working with are evaluating ways to reduce infection risk and streamline workflows as those programs grow. If you're attending the conference, I'd welcome the chance to compare notes. This small shift makes outreach feel more relevant than promotional. Once messaging is outlined, we typically recommend using 3 coordinated channels. First is a call campaign. Ideally, reps should follow up within 48 hours of sending the first email. The purpose of that call is to simply confirm whether the person will be attending or other specific meeting times blocked.
And I just want to jump in here and share that with a call campaign, this is pretty tough for a sales team to orchestrate on their own. We know that they are feet on the street and constantly running, doing meeting. So there are a lot of really good third-party outbound calling campaign partners that you can leverage, some that are even in the MedTech space exclusively. That will help to really have an aggressive campaign to book those meetings ahead of time. And they're also aligned with your sales team, your marketing, your leadership on messaging, on what you want the desired outcome to be. So we would recommend leveraging one of those third parties. Sorry, Kimberly, back to you.
Second is an email sequence. Typically, this includes an initial email with a personalized reason to meet, a follow-up email sharing a relevant value asset like a clinical paper or case study example, and a final email confirming whether they will be attending the conference. The third channel is LinkedIn. Your rep should view the contact's profile, send a short, personalized note, and reference mutual connections if applicable. Using multiple channels significantly increases the chance of connecting before the show. The first step during this phase is tracking everything in CRM. That includes logging outreach attempts, tracking confirmed meetings, tagging accounts associated with the event, and identifying contacts who did not respond but still may be a good candidate for on-site targeting. The goal of this entire process is not booth traffic, it's scheduled conversations. When we see companies generate meaningful pipeline from events, one thing is almost always true. Their sales team arrive on site with a calendar that is already partially full. That creates structure, accountability, and momentum. Without that preparation, the booth presence becomes dependent on random foot traffic, and that is a much better way to build real opportunities.
And I just want to say here that with a lot of this targeted outreach, again, it seems like a lot. The onus is not completely on your sales team. This should be a combined effort with marketing, sales, leadership, sales enablement. Some of you might be saying, hey, that's a group of 3 people, and that's fine, but there can be shared opportunities, shared responsibilities to make sure that the sales team is empowered to have this outreach and to be supported by other teammates. 6 to 8 weeks is when the show messaging, branding, and sales execution all need to lock into place. Up to this point, we've defined the accounts we want to engage and we've begun outreach. But if the team isn't aligned on what story we're telling and how the conversation should progress, these meetings often don't translate into real opportunities. So this phase focuses on 5 very specific things. The first is defining your event narrative. This is essentially answering 3 questions. What problem are we solving? For whom specifically are we solving it? And why does that matter to them right now? At a conference, you don't have the luxury of a long sales cycle to explain your positioning. People are making snap decisions about whether to engage with you or not. So the narrative should be very clear and very simple. For example, instead of leading with a product feature, the narrative might start with something like, many health systems are struggling with rising infection control requirements and increasingly complex ultrasound workflows. We're helping organizations modernize their process by A, B, and C. That kind of framing immediately anchors the conversation in a problem that your buyer recognizes. The next step is aligning your visual branding to that narrative. Your booth graphics, your meeting suite signage, and your presentation materials should all reinforce that same core message. A good rule of thumb is that somebody walking past the booth should be able to immediately understand what your product does, who it's for, and why it matters. The goal of the booth design isn't just to attract traffic with pretty colors and nice images, it's to help the right buyer self-identify. And when somebody sees messaging and thinks, hey, this is exactly what we're dealing with, That is when they stop and engage. The third element here is developing what we call the elevator pitch, which I know that you all are probably very aware of with your sales team, but we're going to talk about doing that at an event level. Every sales rep should be able to explain the solution using the same basic structure: problem, outcome, proof. For example, we work with hospitals that are struggling to maintain consistent high-level disinfection for ultrasound probes. Problem: our system automates that process in seconds, which helps reduce infection risk and simplify compliance. Outcome: several large health systems have already adopted it as their standard workflow. Proof: the exact wording may vary slightly, but the core structure should be consistent across your entire team. And that consistency is incredibly important when you have multiple reps working in the booth. The fourth element here is defining qualification and next step criteria. This is where many conferences and conversations fall apart. A great discussion happens in the booth, but nobody defines what should happen next. So teams should align in advance on basic qualification questions like, is there a defined budget or purchasing cycle? What's the timeline for evaluating solutions? And who has decision authority? And most importantly, every conversation should end with a very clear next step. That might be a scheduled product demo, a site visit, or a proposal or PO review, or even a follow-up meeting with additional stakeholders. If the next step isn't defined during the conversation, the momentum from the conference is going to disappear. And finally, the last piece of this phase is mandatory rep training. I know nobody's a fan of it, but it makes a huge difference. Before the event, the sales team should spend time role-playing qualification conversations, practicing objection handling, and aligning on the language used to set up those next steps. This does not have to be long and complicated and boring. Even a short 30-minute internal session can really make a huge difference. Because when reps arrive on site, confident in the messaging, clear about the objective of each conversation, the booth operates much more like a structured pipeline building environment rather than just a place for casual product demos and conversation. Kimberly, 1 week before.
By the time you're 1 week out from the event, the goal should not be scrambling to generate interest. The goal should be finalizing logistics and reinforcing the conversations that are already scheduled. At this stage, we typically recommend a few operational steps. First, confirm all pre-scheduled meetings. Make sure the right internal people will be present for each conversation. Second, review the priority account list with the team. Everyone staffing the booth should know which accounts are strategically important. And third, make sure the team understands how conversations should transition into next steps. One of the biggest mistakes we see at this stage is teams assuming that momentum will happen automatically once the exhibit hall opens. But remember the stat we discussed earlier? Attendees only spend about 8 to 9 hours in the exhibit hall across the entire conference. So the companies who succeed are usually the ones who arrive with a very clear plan for how that time will be used.
Absolutely. So let me give you a quick example of what happens when this early planning phase doesn't happen. There was a MedTech company a few years ago that had invested heavily in a major conference. They had a beautiful booth, strong technology, great clinical story. But when we asked the commercial team which accounts they specifically needed to advance during the event, there wasn't a clear answer. Their plan was essentially to generate as many leads as possible and sort it out afterwards. And they did. They ended up collecting hundreds of badge scans. But when they reviewed the pipeline a few weeks later, almost none of those conversations had progressed. And the reason was simple. There was no defined commercial objective going into the event. Without that clarity, the team spent 3 days talking to interesting people, maybe even applicable people, but not the right people for deal progression.
And I'll share a very different example from another MedTech program. The team began planning their conference strategy about 3 months before the event. They identified roughly 20 target hospitals that were already in various stages of evaluation. 8 weeks before the conference, their sales team began reaching out to those accounts to schedule time on site. By the time the conference started, their meeting calendar already had about 15 strategic conversations scheduled. The booth still generated some new leads, which was great, but the real value of the event came from those pre-planned conversations with decision makers. Several of those meetings Several of those meetings directly accelerated procurement discussions that were already underway. And then there's another example that I'd like to share. Another idea to leverage your executive leaders or medical KOLs is by hosting a fireside chat in your booth. Trade show data shows that attendees and sponsors are highly interested in educational engagement in the booth. Hosting an informal conversation is an engaging alternative to a formal presentation or speech, followed by a robust Q&A discussion. Your team will have a captive audience of potential leads and should have a strategy ready to engage and qualify them.
Thank you, Kimberly. All right, I know we threw a lot at you there with the pre-show strategy, but we are moving right along here to what you should be doing on site. So earlier, we talked about the reality that attendees only spend 8 to 9 hours total in the exhibit hall across the entire conference. That is a very small window of time. And that means that every interaction needs to be intentional. One way high-performing teams manage this is by starting each morning with a quick alignment meeting. They review the day's scheduled meetings, confirm which accounts are strategic priorities, and make sure everyone staffing the booth understands where those conversations currently stand. At the end of the day, the team reviews what exactly happened, which meetings occurred, what insights were captured, and what follow-up actions needed to happen immediately. Another key practice is confirming the objective before each conversation begins. If a prospect walks into the booth, the question isn't, oh, how can I help you? It's, what are you hoping to learn from this conversation? That clarity helps determine whether the conversation should focus on clinical questions, operational implementation, or commercial next steps. Because without having that structure, conversations often stay at a basic surface level and they never progress towards meaningful opportunities. Now, this slide addresses a dynamic that almost every commercial leader has seen happen. The booth opens, and very quickly the environment becomes social. People reconnect with colleagues, competitors stop by to say hello, old industry contacts want to catch up. And those conversations, they can be enjoyable and valued from a networking standpoint, but they also can consume an enormous amount of time. And remember the reality of the exhibit hall. Attendees do not have much time to be in there. And even beyond that, most clinicians may only spend a couple of hours in the hall across the conference. They don't take advantage of the full 8 to 9 hours. So every minute that your team spends in the booth, it has to be intentional. And that's why we encourage teams to control booth behavior and avoid drifting into what we call friendly mode. Every conversation in the booth should accomplish one of three things. First, you have to qualify your opportunity. Is this organization a potential buyer? Are they already exploring solutions in this area? Do they have a problem that you specifically can help them solve? Second, you need to disqualify quickly when it's appropriate. Not every conversation is a real opportunity, and that's okay. But if someone is simply curious with no organizational relevance, the team should politely redirect the conversation so their time can be focused on higher value interactions. And the third outcome is scheduling the next step. And I know we talk about this a lot, but it's very important. If a conversation is meaningful, it should end with a clear follow-up action. If none of those three things happen, the interaction was networking. It was not pipeline development. The second discipline is asking direct qualification questions. Sales teams sometimes hesitate to ask these questions because they don't want to appear too salesy or, make somebody upset. But the reality is that decision makers expect to have direct conversations. That means asking things like, what's driving this initiative internally for your organization, Dr. So-and-so? What timeline are you working towards? Who else is typically involved in evaluating a solution like this? These questions help determine whether the conversation should progress to a deeper engagement. And they also prevent teams from spending 10 minutes giving a product demo to somebody who has zero purchasing influence. And that leads us to our final piece, which is securing the next steps while that person is still in the booth. It sounds awkward, but You should be doing these three things before the conversation ends. First, send a calendar invite while that person is still standing there. They're not going to decline your calendar invite when you're standing right in front of them. Second, confirm the next step and timeline very clearly. And third, make sure that there is a clear owner on your company side that's responsible for follow-up. One phrase we do not want to hear is, hey, let's connect after the show. Because guess what happens after the show? Everyone goes back to overflowing inboxes, travel recovery, and competing priorities. And that follow up often never happens. So when the next step is scheduled on site while your target is there, the momentum from that conversation is preserved. And that's ultimately the difference between booths that generate pipeline and booths that generate a stack of business cards. Kimberly?
Executives are one of the most powerful assets a company can bring into the conference environment, but they're also frequently underutilized or misused. A common pattern we see is executives standing in the booth, greeting visitors, or casually participating in conversations. But executive time is much more valuable when it's used strategically. Executives should typically be brought into conversations when an opportunity involves hospital leadership or purchasing decisions, a strategic partnership is being explored, or a conversation requires organization alignment beyond product features. When an executive joins a conversation, it signals commitment and seriousness, and that often changes the tone of the discussion. Another place when executive involvement can be extremely powerful is in conjunction with programs, dinners, and small private gatherings during a trade show. These settings allow for deeper conversations with key stakeholders. Instead of a 5-minute booth interaction, you have an environment where clinicians, administrators, or partners can discuss broader questions like implementation, workflow impact, or long-term collaboration. When used thoughtfully, these smaller settings can significantly accelerate trust and decision-making.
Absolutely. So now we are moving into our post-show strategy phase. Kimberly, can you talk about the first 24 hours?
Yep. The first 24 hours after a conference are incredibly important. When a conversation happens face to face at a booth, there's usually momentum and interest, but that momentum fades quickly once everyone gets back on planes and returns to their normal schedules. So the goal in the first 24 hours is very simple. Capture and reinforce the progress that was made during the event. There are a few specific actions that help with that. First, send a short, personalized recap to each person you met with. This doesn't have to be long, but it should reference something specific from the conversation so the recipient knows this isn't a generic follow-up. Second, confirm the next meeting that was discussed. If a follow-up call or demo was mentioned at the booth, this is the moment to actually lock that time in on the calendar. And third, capture the insights from the conversation in CRM while everything is still fresh. Trade shows generate a lot of informal information, implementation, questions, budget timing, and internal champions. And those details can easily get lost if they aren't documented immediately. This early follow-through is one of the easiest ways to separate high-performing commercial teams from average ones.
Excellent. And one thing I do want to say here is that we all know that trade shows are somehow a sprint and a marathon at the same time. Long days, tons of conversations. It's hard to remember all those details and get them into your CRM. So I would recommend for your sales team using something like Listel or Plod, where they can toggle off and on recording in the booth so that it can help to capture any meaningful questions, conversations, contacts, so that follow-up in the first 24 hours can be highly personalized, customized, and it shows your targets and your customers that you're listening to them. Back to you, Kimberly.
One pattern we see across many organizations is what we call meeting decay. A good conversation happens at the booth. Both sides agree that a follow-up meeting would make sense, but the next step is never secured. Then the week after the conference becomes busy, emails pile up, priorities shift, and that potential meeting quietly disappears. So protecting the next step is about making sure that momentum doesn't evaporate. That means confirming the calendar invites were accepted, following up on tentative meeting holds that were discussed during the conference, and proactively re-engaging any account when the next step wasn't clearly confirmed. Because if a meeting isn't actually on the calendar, opportunity is still very fragile. Trade shows create momentum, but that momentum only turns into pipeline when it converts into a scheduled next conversation.
Absolutely. And not every conversation at a conference carries the same strategic importance. You'll have exploratory discussions, early awareness conversations, and even casual networking interactions, hopefully not too many. But you'll also have conversations with very high value accounts, a major hospital system, a large IDN, or a strategic partner that could materially impact your company's growth. When those conversations happen, the follow up should reflect that importance. One of the most effective ways to do that is through executive reinforcement. A short follow up note from a CEO, chief commercial officer, or another senior leader can dramatically change how the conversation is perceived inside your target's organization. That message often gets forwarded internally, which helps elevate the opportunity across clinical leadership, procurement teams, or even operational leadership. So, executive follow up is not just a courtesy, it's a signal that your company is serious about the relationship and you're committed to moving the conversation forward. And one of the simplest but most powerful practices we recommend is a structured leadership review roughly 1 week after the conference. At that point, the team has had time to complete initial follow ups and confirm next meetings. So, the focus of that review should not be activity metrics like booth traffic or lead counts. Instead, leadership should ask a few very direct questions. How many next meetings did we actually confirm? Which priority accounts progressed to the next stage of evaluation or the next step in the sales process? Which follow ups are still pending? And where might the commercial team need additional support, whether it be from executives, from marketing, from sales ops? This review reinforces accountability, but it also helps leadership quickly identify opportunities that might require executive engagement or those additional resources. Without this check in, it is just very easy for the energy from the conference to dissipate, and then you don't have ROI. Okay, so now we're just going to bring it all together: earn, convert, and protect. When we step back and look at conferences that consistently generate that meaningful pipeline, chances are they're following the same three-phase structure. And that is that pre-show preparation, where you're earning the right conversations before the event begins. This means that you're defining a revenue objective tied to the show, identifying the specific accounts you want to engage, and activating targeted outreach early. It also means that you're aligning messaging across the team and you're deploying executive engagement intentionally for priority accounts. When that work is done well, your most important prospects already know you want to meet before they ever walk into the hall. The second phase that we discussed today was on-site execution. And this is where the conversations convert into commitments. The booth is not a passive marketing space. It should operate like a structured meeting environment. Teams should be prioritizing pre-identified target accounts, qualifying conversations with discipline, and leveraging executives strategically when key stakeholders arrive. And most importantly, every meaningful conversation should end with that clearly defined next step before the person leaves the booth. And the third phase, again, that we just talked about is that post-show follow-through. And this, unfortunately, is where a lot of organizations do lose momentum. They're all exhausted after the trade show. They're looking forward. But what we need to see is meetings should be confirmed within 24 hours while those conversations are still fresh. Priority accounts should receive reinforced engagement. And within about a week, leadership should review the pipeline generated from the event and track whether those opportunities are progressing through to the next stages. That accountability ensures the event actually translates into revenue outcomes. And when these three phases work together, a trade show stops functioning as a marketing activity. It becomes a pipeline acceleration environment. And that shift in mindset from event participation to commercial execution is what allows organizations to consistently generate measurable ROI from their conferences. All right, we are going to pause for another poll here. I know that we have thrown a lot at you, but the question is, would you like to book a discovery call to discuss how to strengthen your next strategy for your next trade show? There is no right or wrong answer here. If you do say yes, our webinar admin will be dropping a link in the chat, and you can book directly with myself, Kimberly, and Lisa Bixel, our founder. No pressure, quick 30-minute call. You'll also receive a free copy of Lisa Bixel's book, so you're launching a medical device for jumping on a brief call with us. All right. Thank you, everybody. Now we are moving on to our Q&A. I'm going to get that screen open here. Okay, so I see a question here. Please define your three-letter acronyms like ICW. I believe that we covered that later on, but Kimberly, can you just remind us what ICW is?
Yes, it's a common acronym in the trade show uh, lexicon, and it means in conjunction with. So, an in conjunction with is it's an ancillary event in conjunction with the overall trade show activities, programs that are sponsored and hosted by a particular conference or trade show. So, it means in conjunction with.
Right, so we're working with the trade show, not, or with the
Yes.
association, not outside of the association parameters.
Exactly. And an important thing to understand about in conjunction with when you do host separate events or in conjunction with, oftentimes the organizing trade show, the conference organizers and trade show, you have to have approval for your in conjunction with. It's painless. You submit an application. So just so that they know and they have an idea of what's going on overall with that particular conference or trade show.
Excellent. Thank you, Kimberly. I see a question here that's you briefly talked about KOL engagement, but how do we leverage our KOLs more at trade shows?
Well, another strategy for KOL engagement is to identify opportunities for your KOL to make, for example, remarks from the podium during a general session. And our consultant team, this is one of the things that we work with our client partners to help you identify opportunities to ensure alignment and that it's a good fit for your organization.
Excellent. Thank you. I see another question here is that societies don't provide contact information on pre-show reg lists. So how are we supposed to accurately leverage them? Um, so what you can do is there are plenty online platforms. There's Zoom Info, there's Apollo. If there's an HCP heavy event, there's Alpha Sophia. And those, again, not super expensive. That is data enrichment. My suggestion is that you receive the pre-show registration list, you go through that and you look at where your target accounts are listed, highlight those, and then pull those through for data enrichment for quick follow-up via email and for phone. I see another question here. My team should have attended this. Is there a next Zoom presentation? Is this PowerPoint available? Yes. So there is not a second live program. However, since you attended, you'll be receiving a copy of these slides, and we'll also be publishing the recording online, and you'll receive an email with information on how to access that. Any advice for pre-revenue companies? Yes. So I think you understand our thought process here of go beyond the booth. If you are a pre-revenue company, an event can still be a wonderful opportunity for networking, for getting voice of customer, for starting to get feedback from who ultimately your targets will be. My suggestion is to have a couple members of your leadership team attend. Maybe you can have a separate meeting room that's in the host hotel or in the host convention center, and you do the same exact kind of outreach where you reach out to your targets, you reach out to strategic partners, and you just have conversations with them. Some might need to be under NDA, but you can start to lay that foundation, talk with thought leaders, establish yourself as a thought leader, and make sure that when you get around to when you are generating revenue, you already have a really strong foundation going into events. Um, okay, let's see. Thanks, guys, for the great questions. Uh, are you saying, I'm going to kick this over to you, Kimberly. Are you saying that random booth traffic isn't important at all?
Oh, no, not at all. So going back to the example that we gave earlier about the fireside chat. So in that scenario, you will invite people, you will promote that chat, but you will also have random visitors stop by during the chat. And so you never know who is there, who you're talking to. And the key to making or to maximizing that opportunity to engage with a random booth visitor is to have qualifying questions. So when you're strategizing on how you're going to engage with booth visitors, random booth traffic visitors should be a part of that strategy so that you have questions in mind to engage with them and how to qualify that person who stops by your booth.
Excellent. Thank you. And something else that we had discussed during the webinar was net new account goals as well, which could be generated by random booth traffic. Again, as Kimberly said, as long as you're qualifying that booth traffic appropriately. Um, I see a question here about identifying priority accounts. So, how do we do that effectively? There should be, you look at your pipeline, but you also need to look at where has your company commercially been successful before, whether it's a shortened sales cycle, it's the opportunity where you've been able to land and expand in an account. What were the telltale attributes of that account, and what accounts are currently in your pipeline that share many of those attributes? From there, you'll also look at, budget. You'll look at the timeline for acquisition, and you'll also look at a couple of other factors. And the sales team, sales leadership, marketing team should all sit down together, determine who those priority accounts are, and then map them to event attendance. If we all go into the conversation with the set parameters for what qualifies or what constitutes a priority target account, we are all going to be able to win faster when we're there on site or doing any kind of pre-show outreach. All right, I have another question here. Um, should we be considering dinner programs at trade shows?
That's a great question, and absolutely, you should be considering an in conjunction with dinner. It's a great way to have a more intimate one-on-one or advance an earlier conversation that you began with a targeted guest. It's critical that you are strategic when you plan an in conjunction with dinner program by cross-checking the overall trade show calendar of events to make sure that your event is not conflicting with another popular event where some of your guests may want to attend. And then also, if you are planning in conjunction with dinners and intimate programs, it's important that you confirm your venue early because these dinners are very popular and local venues they book up very early. So we encourage you to book 60 to 90 days out, secure your venue 60 to 90 days out if you're able.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kimberly. Okay, I think that that is it for our questions, which is great because we only have a few minutes left and a couple more things that I want to share with you all. So it's important to us that you can make what we talked about actionable without having to even hop on a discovery call with us. Of course, we would love one, but what you'll be receiving for attending this program is a trade show pipeline acceleration planner. So this is a planning workbook for all of your pre-show outreach, targeting, messaging needs that will help you to have a good system to organize and to make this process repeatable for yourself. You'll also receive a post-show revenue conversion playbook, which is a framework to convert event conversations into pipeline. Again, just a simple workbook that helps you operationalize what we talked about today. And then again, should you join a discovery call with us, you'll receive a free copy of Lisa Bixel, our founder's book, that has a lot more information about marketing and commercialization success, but also talks about trade shows as well. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure speaking with you. We will be reaching out today or tomorrow with all of the tools we discussed, a link to the webinar recording and the slides. And we look forward to the next time that we get to host a webinar for you all. Thank you.
Thank you.